como expresión irrefutable de su decisión de lucha, paralizando la mano armada del invasor. Proclama que cuenta con la comprensión y el apoyo de todos los pueblos del mundo y especialmente del campo socialista encabezado por la Unión Soviética. Esa proclama es patria o muerte.
Ernesto Che Guevara, one of the most polarizing historical figures in recent memory, continues to be the subject of hot debate to this day, perhaps even more so than when he was alive. Although celebrated by some as a liberator and branded as a tyrant by others, the fact remains that Che was and still is an icon of the 20th century. But that raises the question, why Che? What makes him such a controversial figure even among certain leftist circles, and what conditions led to the formation of his iconic status? We will explore both of these questions and hopefully find a deeper understanding of the life and legacy of one of the most misrepresented historical figures in modern history. Ernesto Guevara, born in 1928 in Rosario, Argentina, grew up in a family environment that would plant the seeds for the formation of his unscrupulous ideology and unyielding character. Ernesto's family, despite belonging to the upper class of Argentinian society, had strong leftist leanings. Guevara was introduced to a wide spectrum of political ideas even as a child, and from a young age he would devour the works of Marx, Lenin, and Jean-Paul Sartre, among many others. Despite suffering from frequent asthma attacks, he excelled in many sports due to his fighting spirit and aggressive style of play. A curious adventurer from a young age, Che would spend a large part of his early 20s traveling across South America, even putting his medical studies on hold to do so. This period in Che's life would put him firmly on the path towards becoming a communist revolutionary. One of his more notable travels happened in 1951, and saw him traverse over 8,000 kilometers alongside his friend Alberto Granado. During this expedition, Che would come face to face with villagers, miners, and lepers from across the continent and have direct contact with poverty, hunger, and disease that ravaged the lower strata of the peoples of South America, who would later be described by Che as the shivering flesh and blood victims of capitalist exploitation. After finishing his medical studies in Buenos Aires, his subsequent travels brought him to Guatemala, a country that would come to solidify his stance on the necessity of armed struggle in the fight against capitalist imperialism. Namely, following the presidential elections in Guatemala in 1953, Jacobo Arbenz was elected as the country's new president. Arbenz was a leftist-leaning politician that enacted numerous land reforms which benefited the impoverished villages of Guatemala. More specifically, he took away large swaths of uncultivated farmland from the grasp of the American United Fruit Company and redistributed the land to local peasants. Che was fascinated by the direction the country was headed, so he decided to make Guatemala his new home and help support the Arbenz-led Guatemalan government. During his 9-month stay, he would meet his first wife, Hilda Gadea Costa, a leftist-leaning economist that would introduce Che to a number of high-level officials in the Arbenz government. And for the first time, it was in Guatemala that Guevara made contact with a group of Cubans linked to Fidel Castro. During this period, he also acquired his famous moniker, Che, due to his frequent use of the word. Although the Guatemalan government seemed to be headed in the right direction, things took a turn for the worst when a CIA-backed coup overthrew the democratically elected Arbenz government and put in power a pro-American military junta that later snuffed out any leftist elements in the country. Although at first willing to fight against the new insurgent government, due to lack of opposition and strong military leadership, Che was forced to flee to nearby Mexico. Hilda Gadea Costa, Che's first wife, would later write, "It was Guatemala which finally convinced him of the necessity for armed struggle and for taking the initiative against imperialism. By the time he left, he was sure of this." while in Mexico, Che would meet up again with Cuban exiles he met in Guatemala, and soon after he would come face to face with Fidel Castro for the first time. Fidel and his brother Raul fled to nearby Mexico following a failed attack on a military barracks in Cuba, and it was in Mexico they started to prepare for the final armed struggle against the ruthless Cuban dictatorship helmed by Fulgencio Batista. Che, enraged and inspired by his past experiences across South America and Guatemala, was sympathetic to what he saw as a noble cause spearheaded by Fidel Castro and his comrades. In the end, he decided to join the fight against the Batista regime. They secretly disembarked on Cuban soil in early December of 1956, and after initially suffering great casualties due to an unexpected ambush, Che and Fidel managed to retreat to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they met up with already existing rebel forces. From that position, they succeeded in expanding their movement, thereby inciting revolt throughout the region. The Cuban Revolution would continue to last for 2 more years, until the final overthrow of Fulgencio Batista in January of 1959. During those 2 years, Ernesto Che Guevara proved to be an integral part of Fidel's army. Guevara showed unprecedented resolve, ability and intelligence that quickly saw him rise through the ranks of the rebel forces. He helped to establish hospitals, weapon factories, schools, workshops, as well as a newspaper and a radio station to counter the propaganda of the government-run media. In the end, it didn't take long for Fidel Castro to promote him to the rank of Comandante, making him effectively second in command. Guevara would prove to be a harsh disciplinarian who on several occasions shot defectors, informers and spies, and as a result, he became feared for his ruthlessness. But although he maintained a harsh disposition, by almost all accounts, the men that served under him admired and respected him greatly because of his bravery, intelligence and unwavering determination. He fought side by side with his subordinates and risked his life on multiple occasions to save his comrades. Thomas Alba, who fought under Guevara's command, would later state, "Che was loved, in spite of being stern and demanding. We would have given our life for him." After multiple key victories of the revolutionary rebel forces, most notably at the Battle of Santa Clara, where Che played a key role, the oppressive regime was toppled over. In Cuba, the guerrilla revolutionaries would form their own government, with Fidel Castro at its helm, and at the early stages of his regime, Ernesto Che Guevara would be one of the key figureheads that would spearhead the country's further development. For 6 years, starting from 1959 until 1965, Ernesto Che Guevara would fulfill multiple roles in the Cuban government. He was the director of the infamous La Cabaña prison fortress, Minister of Industries, Governor of the Central Bank, and finally a diplomat of Cuba. In this period, Che also played a central role in training the militia forces who repelled the Bay of Pigs invasion and bringing Soviet nuclear-armed ballistic missiles to Cuba, which later led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. By the end of 1965, Castro publicly revealed an undated letter purportedly written to him by Che. In the letter, Guevara reaffirmed his enduring solidarity with the Cuban Revolution but declared his intention to leave Cuba to fight for the revolutionary cause abroad. Additionally, he resigned from all his positions in the Cuban government and the Communist Party of Cuba and renounced his honorary Cuban citizenship. Guevara left Cuba in 1965 to support leftist revolutions first in the Democratic Republic of Congo and finally in Bolivia, where he was captured by CIA-assisted Bolivian forces and executed by firing squad at the age of 39. The fact that Che Guevara lived such a short but turbulent life only made his fame and infamy spread faster. Namely, there are many unsubstantiated claims, both critical and complementary to Che's legacy, made by opposing sides of the political spectrum that to a degree paint a wrong picture of the man. One of the more common reasons for this misrepresentation is the fact that many criticisms related to Che's character only take into account the early period of his life. One of the more obvious examples in this regard is the issue of racism, more specifically, Ernesto Che Guevara's unflattering view of black people. In order to corroborate this supposed fact, Che's detractors frequently quote the following passages from the famous motorcycle diaries written during his early travels across South America. The blacks, those magnificent examples of the African race who have maintained their racial purity thanks to their lack of an affinity with bathing, have seen their territory invaded by a new kind of slave, the Portuguese. The black is indolent and a dreamer, spending his meager wage on frivolity or drink. The European has a tradition of work and saving, which has pursued him as far as this corner of America and drives him to advance himself, even independently of his own individual aspirations. When reading these passages, one can rightly claim that Che Guevara, who wrote this diary, did express views that would undoubtedly be labeled as racist. But when discussing this issue, several key aspects have to be kept in mind. Namely, the quoted passages from the motorcycle diaries were written by a 24-year-old Che, who by that point lived in an environment where such attitudes were unfortunately common. They were also written prior to him becoming an ardent communist and before he significantly socialized with members of the black population. When we look at later stages of Che's life, that is, after he became a communist revolutionary, there is hardly any evidence that Che supported such ideas, and what's more, his ideology took on a more anti-racist character. In his 1964 address to the United Nations, Guevara said the following regarding the racial policies of the United States of America. How can a country which murders its own children and discriminates between them daily because of the color of their skins, a country that allows the murderers of black people to go free and punishes the blacks for demanding respect for their lawful rights as free human beings, claim to be a guardian of liberty? In Cuba, following the successful overthrow of the Batista regime, Castro sought to bring in legislation that would guarantee full rights for Afro-Cubans, and at no point did Ernesto Che Guevara oppose such policies. And in the end, what perhaps best exemplifies the fact that Che left behind any racist sentiments is the fact that he fought side by side with the Congolese Simba rebels, and at no point did he think himself superior on any sort of racial basis. With all that said, when discussing the moral integrity of Ernesto Che Guevara, one cannot avoid perhaps the most serious accusation of them all, and that is that Che was a murderer. Namely, during the Cuban Revolution and his short-term and post-revolutionary Cuban government, as well as the Simba Rebellion in the Congo and the Bolivia expedition, Che Guevara was definitely either directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of numerous individuals. The exact number is debated and cannot be ascertained with certainty, but it more than likely goes in the hundreds. Che Guevara saw armed revolution as the solution to the injustices he saw during his travels across South America. When he finally arrived in Cuba, he took up arms and had no moral qualms about killing the people he saw as his enemies. In general, these individuals were policemen, soldiers, government officials, and collaborators associated with the regimes that Che Guevara viewed as imperialist and oppressive in nature. During the Cuban Revolution, there were numerous firing squad executions among the ranks of the rebel army, and Che was one of Castro's chief enforcers in this regard, often even carrying out the executions himself. The executed individuals were killed mostly because of treason, aiding the enemy, desertion, or spying. And to be fair, in many countries at the time, including the United States, most of these crimes did carry the death penalty. But what certainly leaves a stain in Che's legacy to a degree is the fact that almost none of the accused were subjected to a military trial, and even if they were, the outcome was almost always predetermined. Following the overthrow of Fulgencio Batista's regime and the establishment of a post-revolutionary Cuban government, Che Guevara was put in charge of La Cabaña fortress prison. During his 5-month tenure, Guevara oversaw the revolutionary tribunals and executions of the individuals who had opposed the communist revolution. The trials left a lot to be desired if we are to measure them according to the standards of a modern democratic judicial system, because almost all of them were summary show trials. Che Guevara's duties as the commander of La Cabaña consisted of reviewing the verdicts, offering pardons, and setting execution dates. During his tenure, he oversaw more than 100 executions and, by most accounts, rarely issued any pardons. Because of his role in this regard, he would later be named by his detractors as the Butcher of La Cabaña. So to answer the question, did Che kill people? The answer would obviously be yes, but to say he was a murderer is slightly more debatable. By almost all accounts, at no point did he kill innocent civilians. His victims were soldiers in battle, deserters, traitors, informers, and war criminals. But it is a fact that many were shot without a trial, and even if there was one, in most cases the outcome was predetermined. Ernesto Che Guevara believed that the only way to defend a revolution was to eliminate its enemies, and he would not be swayed by any ethical arguments. reasons as to why Che became a pop culture phenomenon are certainly nuanced and multifaceted, but in general one can point at several factors that helped propel him to such a status. The first thing that springs to mind when someone mentions Ernesto Che Guevara would probably be the image that immortalized his charisma and his youthful appearance. Taken on March 5, 1960 in Havana, Cuba, during a memorial service for the victims of the infamous La Cuba incident, the photograph, together with Guevara's subsequent actions and eventual execution, helped solidify Che as a cultural icon. Although virtually unknown until Che's death, today it is frequently labeled as the world's most famous photograph and is thought to be the most reproduced image in the history of photography. Alberto Korda, Ernesto's personal photographer who took the photo and a lifelong communist and supporter of the Cuban Revolution, famously never asked for royalties nor any kind of payment for his picture. Korda was of the opinion that the photograph represented Che's revolutionary ideals, and thus the more his picture spread, the greater the chance Che's ideals would spread as well. According to some, Korda's refusal to seek royalties for the vast circulation of his photograph in part helped consolidate Che as an ultimate revolutionary symbol. But regardless of the photo's artistic qualities or commercial appeal, it wouldn't have been so ubiquitous without the actions and the character of Ernesto Che Guevara behind the photograph. Namely, Che was an international revolutionary and a citizen of the world, an Argentinian who put his life on the line not only for the successful liberation of Cuba, but also for the establishment of a leftist government in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Bolivia, countries that span two continents. He could have easily held some ceremonial position in the Cuban government for the rest of his life, but he continued fighting for his ideals to his last breath. This international character certainly made him more appealing to the leftist youth of the world, as well as an everlasting person of interest for the US government, which in turn made his image even more present in the international media. Che's death, as much as his life, established his iconic status, for he would die a martyr's death. Cut from any potential aid or reinforcement in the jungles of Bolivia, after months of hiding and running, Che was captured and killed by CIA-assisted Bolivian forces at the young age of 39. The pictures of Guevara's dead body circulated while his legend began to spread. Visual and thematic similarities to that of a saint were readily apparent, and much to the chagrin of his enemies, Ernesto Che Guevara would come to be revered by many as a model revolutionary who met a heroic death. Whatever one's opinion of Che is, no one can rightly call him a hypocrite. He was an idealist to the core who refused to take a more pragmatic approach to politics and international relations similar to Fidel Castro. As government official, he harvested sugarcane shoulder to shoulder with Cuban peasants. As Comandante, he fought alongside the soldiers he commanded. From a young age, throughout his life and in his death, Che showed unwavering commitment, perhaps to a fault. And for better or worse, Ernesto Che Guevara continues to be a symbol of tyranny for some and a symbol of freedom for many others.